Good morning. You're listening to Retake Conversation with Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1, your public radio station. And today we're going to be speaking with former New Mexico State Senator from Senate District 13, now held by Senator Bill O'Neill. So she is also the author of pretty much the go-to book on the New Mexico State Senate and by extension, the legislature and how it operates. And the title of that book is Inside the New Mexico Senate, Boots, Suits, and Citizens. And to that, this session at least, we can add boots, suits, Zooms, and citizens. We'll get to Dede in just a moment, but first, a couple of announcements. Last week, we spoke with Dede Feldman, the Director of Health Security for New Mexicans campaign, in an interview that dissected the next rendition of the Health Security Act, HB 203, Health Security Plan and Design. And that bill is going through some very interesting shenanigans to try and get it through House Appropriations and Finance Committee. The week prior, we spoke with Angela Merkert. She's the executive director of the Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, the organization that's coordinating the effort to develop a state public bank. And then the week before that, in our continuing coverage of bills that Retake is supporting at the Roundhouse, we spoke with Mariel Nanasi, Director of New Energy Economy, who is pushing for both revisions to the Energy Transition Act and for passage of local choice energy. And I believe that bill will be heard Thursday, Saturday, so it's probably happened. If you are driving around today and don't catch all of the show, you can watch today's show and all the prior shows simply by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the Actions and Events menu in the menu bar, and then clicking on Retake Conversations. So I want to also, before we get started, acknowledge that we're doing this show on stolen Tewa land and to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of that land. I also want to remind you that Retake Our Democracy has a 2021 legislative strategy and 20 transformational bills and 28 priority bills for which we are advocating. And the Roundhouse is winding down. By the time you hear this, we're 1 week from finished, and so there's lots to be done. And so I'd encourage you to use that page at retakeourdemocracy.org. Just click on New Mexico legislation or NM legislation, and there's a raft of resources, a list of our bills, and then attached to that are summaries with speaking points. And there's contact information for all the legislators. There's all kinds of stuff there. So check that out. I think that's enough for today. So let's get started. Welcome, Dede. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm not sure which it is. Good morning.
Well, I don't even know what day it is anymore. You know, it's like, did I shower? No, anyway, I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So if you could take a minute or two to tell us about yourself and how you found yourself as a state legislator, and then what provoked you to write a book about it?
Well, I came to New Mexico in 1975, settled in the North Valley, and with my husband built one of the first passive solar adobe homes. Worked for an underground newspaper. So I was a journalist for a while, a freelancer, covering a lot of the issues that end up in the New Mexico legislature, and worked for helping women run for office during the 1980s and the 1990s, and finally ran myself in 1995 for the city council. I lost by 9 votes. And continued on, and the next year won a seat in the state Senate. And I retired from that seat in 2012 after 16 years in the Senate, and a committee chair for 10 years. And I decided
What committee were you chair of?
I was chair of the Public Affairs Committee,
Okay.
which has now been renamed the Health and Public
Right.
Affairs Committee, and it's chaired by Jerry Ortiz Pino now.
Right.
So I used to call it the Vice Committee because it considered all the vices: gambling, tobacco, alcohol, in addition to healthcare and a lot of other stuff. So it's a key committee, I think, for many of the bills for people that care about human services. So I really wanted to write about the New Mexico Senate because I felt like people didn't really know what was going on from the inside. Redistricting, I think, is a good example of that. Although that book did not cover redistricting. But you know, it's important for advocates. It's important for folks who want to make change to understand how the New Mexico Senate and the legislature in general work, so that they can be effective, and also to encourage the senators and representatives to be more transparent. Anyway, I was there in an era where there was great resistance to transparency and even to webcasting the session, which we can't think of now in this time of COVID. But it took us maybe 4 years to get that adopted, really by rule. And it certainly became, just like many changes, inevitable when people then began to have cell phones with which they could video what was going on. But it was only then that the legislature really said, okay, well, we ought to set up a system for doing this. So since I've been out of the legislature, I've been serving on several boards, and including Health Action New Mexico, the Foundation for Open Government, or FOG, and also working with Common Cause as kind of a consultant on some of the issues that I worked on very hard from the inside, which were ethics and campaign finance, other structural reforms like that.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about some of those in just a bit. I know you're retired from the Senate, but I also know, as you suggested there, you still keep a keen eye on what's going on in the Roundhouse. What are some of the bills you're watching this year, and how are they doing?
Well, I'm watching a number of them for Common Cause, obviously. Public financing of judicial elections is one, and redistricting is another. Continuation of any transparency efforts in terms of capital outlay, in terms of campaign contribution disclosures by PACs. And but there are others that I'm following. I kind of can't help myself.
Yeah.
Payday lending, for example, a big victory just recently, getting that through the Senate, and a number of bills about prescription drugs and lowering the price of prescription drugs, and also some sleeper bills that are not very sexy but very important, reforms in the tax code. That would increase the rate for the top earners and help out people at the lower end.
Yeah, we've been sort of joined at the hip with Voices for Children. We view them as one of the most effective organizations in the state, especially when you're talking about tax policy. And that's that 291, which is the bill you're referencing, that incorporates the PIT increases, is one of our transformational bills. And so that's that. I couldn't agree with you more. We always say that tax and budget is our moral decisions, not just numbers.
Absolutely.
It's about how much money you're going to have for government to do things and where you're getting it from. And both of those involve a moral choice.
Yes.
I kind of knew your interest in the whole redistricting, independent redistricting effort, as you gave me permission to publish your editorial on it. So that wasn't a surprise. Can you fill us in on your experience in 2001? And then I'll follow up to ask you about your observations of what is transpiring in the Roundhouse this session.
Well, I lived through two redistricting sessions as a senator. And before that, I covered one as a reporter. So I kind of have seen the continuum now from 1990 now through 2021. It makes me feel very old. But every session, every redistricting session is different. And of course, it depends upon the census. And it depends upon population changes during the past decade. So first thing I want to say is garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
And that is that if we don't have an accurate count, if we don't count all of the folks on the Navajo reservation, for example, or if we had to contend with non-citizens being discounted, or if we have, questions like that are extremely important. Now, this year, there has not been a great population shift and change. It's been kind of a status quo. We won't gain a congressional seat. We won't lose a congressional seat. And the patterns have been relatively stable. But in 2001, there had been great growth on Albuquerque's west side, and also a tremendous loss of population from the rural folks on the east side, moving into the middle Rio Grande Valley. Mm-hmm. So many to Rio Rancho. And so there were changes needed for that reason. And when you have that happening, because the rule is, each Senate district must have the same, más o menos, the same population as the next one, so that every person has an equal voice. That means that if your district, as an incumbent, if your district shrank in population, or not even shrank, but just didn't keep up with the growth in other areas, then your district was at risk of being combined with another one, or maybe being done away with altogether. So that was why in that article that I wrote for the New Mexican, it was a question of pitting one legislator against another. And that was the fear, that you would be running against one of your colleagues of the same party, or that the opposite party would force you into that position. So mm-hmm. I'm not sure that, that will exist this year. And of course, this year is different from 2001, because the Democrats have hit the trifecta. They have the governor's office, the House, and the Senate. At that time, in 2000, there was a Republican governor, a Democratic House, and a Senate that was controlled by a coalition. Headed by Richard Romero, a Democrat from Albuquerque, and the Republicans, the 18 Republicans at that time, and several other Democrats. So that was a very different situation than this year.
Right. Well, the thing is actually our election strategy was really informed by your analysis of how the Senate pro tem decision is such an important decision, yes. And how the coalition that you referenced, which existed basically until this year, was such that it really controlled things in a much more moderate or conservative fashion. And the odd thing is that we've made some real significant changes, and yet we hit the same barriers in House Appropriations and Senate Finance. It's interesting. You know, you think you're finally there, and you find out, well, maybe not quite. Speaker Egolf may regret it, but in a Zoom conversation with Retake, he got real candid in outlining his opposition to independent redistricting, citing how state legislatures controlled by the GOP do far worse than what he has in mind. And I know that in the last couple of days, he and Ivy Soto and others have cobbled together a compromise. I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at it, but eGolf is now going to be a sponsor. What do you think of that?
I think that's a good thing. I think that's a very good thing, and I think maybe it's the best we can hope for under the circumstances. Ivy Soto's point was that there are a lot of legislators that support an independent redistricting commission, but it is not constitutional. That was his point. It would require a constitutional amendment to create an independent redistricting commission. And that commission that was proposed by the advocates, he said, was unconstitutional for that reason, because its recommendations would be binding on the legislature. The compromise bill does not make the recommendations of this citizens committee binding on the legislature. They will be recommendations, and then the legislature can do what it wants.
That's
However,
interesting. You know, I watched Senator Ivy Soto and criticizing the original bill for being unconstitutional. And I had a friend write to me and said, it's interesting, it was drafted by a Supreme Court justice. And Ivy Soto's total judicial experience is as, I think, a magistrate or in municipal court. And so, you know, I'm kind of curious as to how this, you know, retired Supreme Court justice could have, you know, introduced drafted legislation that's unconstitutional. It seems kind of curious, but.
well, Justice Ed Chavez has done a great job. First of all, he's been a great proponent of this. But this is the court of the legislature.
Right. I'm familiar with that court. We need to take a little break here. I want to remind our listeners that it's at times like this that KSFR is so important. We're locked up at home, although we're getting closer to getting out. And because of that, you know, the programming from KSFR can be a real nice release and a way to reconnect with New Mexico culture, arts, music, and opinion shows like this. So if you value KSFR as much as I do, maybe after this show is over, you can go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button at the top right, I believe is where it is, but it's not going to be hard for you to find, and make a donation and kind of view it as your ticket for admission to some really good programming. You haven't spent any money on movies lately, so maybe you can spend it on KSFR. And I just wanted to remind you also that today I'm talking with New Mexico State Senator Dede Feldman. And so we're going to get back to that conversation. Let's move on to other legislation, Dede. I know you have.
Before we do, Paul, I just want to continue one more thing about redistricting.
Okay.
Because, you know, this was right now we're on the road to a compromise, and the Citizens Commission, while its maps will not be binding, it will have a great deal of input. And I think what we ought to keep our eyes on here is the quality of the maps. What we're really looking at here is to have maps that are avoid gerrymandering, that give each person an equal voice, that respect communities of interest, that do not divide up minorities, but give them a chance to elect their own representative if they want.
Right.
And if that's the outcome, that's fine. That's fine. But I do think that in coming sessions, there will be bills for constitutional amendments.
Yeah, and if, you know, and if this works out pretty well, that would speak, or if they completely undo it, you know, if they disregard the recommendations completely, that could be the impetus for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So let's move on to other legislation. I know you have an interest in publicly funded elections. Can you explain why you support that and what might be happening in the legislature this session?
Well, there's a bill that I am supporting, which would extend the Voter Action Act, which is our public financing bill, that first passed in 2003. Ben Lujan and I were the sponsors of that, and it would extend it to district court races. In 2007 we expanded it to appellate courts, the Court of Appeals and the state Supreme Court. And it's worked very well to keep big money out of these races. And we do have the money to expand it now to judicial races, because the PRC will no longer be an elected body. The initial bill, what we were able to get, Ben Lujan and I, we were able to get a pilot program that covered the PRC candidates. We thought that very important, since it was real bread and butter utility issues, that these folks should not be influenced by those that came before them in what really were judicial hearings. So we consider that a great victory. But then, of course, just recently, the PRC has now become appointed. But the fund is there.
Sore spot with me.
The fund is there so that it can be used to expand this to judicial races. And you know, I'm in favor of public financing of all elected races. And the reason is because I think it gives candidates of color, candidates who do not have the means or the confidence that they can raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to compete for these races. And in so doing, some of them will win, and we will be able to level the playing field and really make change in our judiciary and in our elected bodies.
Yeah, well, the next question will speak to that as well. But I wanted to just get quickly your view on what happened with the PRC campaign. I've had conversations with some legislators who felt like the whole campaign was sort of, calling it disingenuous would be kind. Do you have any opinion on that?
I was not a supporter of the amendment. I do not think the public realized that it was removing this as an elected body and substituting a smaller appointed body, which we had before the PRC came into existence in 1998. So I think the funding of the campaign to pass the PRC, with the huge amount of money spent by the Committee to Protect New Mexico Consumers, was kind of a shady deal, because we do not know to this day who funded that PAC that was running so many ads. We do know that Exxon made a big contribution to them. And we assume that the environmentalists were behind this, but there's a great feeling that PNM was the major contributor to that PAC.
I completely agree with you. It's a real sore spot for me. One of the things that I've written about ad nauseum in our uh, in our blog, is that by having a citizens legislature without paid legislators who treat their post as their full-time job and without paid staff, it can take years to even figure out how it works. You know, you get there. When I say they treat it like, if you're going to all the interim hearings, if you're going to the legislature during the session, and if you're studying up on all the issues, and if you're keeping in touch with your constituents, it's a full-time job. And and so when someone comes to the legislature new, they get an orientation and stuff, but it's a whole lot is thrown at them, and it can take years for them to start to figure out what's going on in multiple sessions. In that time frame, they're kind of subject to undue pressure from veteran legislators, lobbyists, and so forth, and from the orientation and the FIRs that they get from the Legislative Services Council. What is your view on getting a paid legislature with paid staff for them?
Well, first of all, it will take a constitutional amendment once again. And that used to be kind of a non-starter. But now it turns out that the public is now in favor of paying legislators. Polling data that Common Cause has completed in the past few years show that. Mm-hmm. And they also show that the public is in favor of a number of other reforms in terms of having longer sessions. And I think that we're due for a revamp here of an institution that was created in 1912 for the benefit of ranchers and farmers who could come to Santa Fe for a short period of time in the off session during January and February. Now we have around the clock crises, health, wildfire, environmental or otherwise, and we need a more time to meet and time to consider these important policy issues with a staff that is loyal to the legislators themselves, rather than to the institution. I think this will improve constituent service tremendously, because now folks like me had to pay for surveys out of their own campaign funds or their own pocket, and depended even on lobbyists for help with the lobbyist clients. But whether it be like a hospital and you have a constituent with a problem with a bill from a hospital, who did I go to? In desperation, I went to the lobbyist for the hospital, and they were able to help quite often. Only too glad to help.
Yeah, exactly. And remember that I help. So Dede, we're out of time for the radio show. We're going to keep talking after we close this, but do you want to tell us how people can get more information on your blog and your books and what you're up to?
Sure. Well, I have written 2 books. One is From the Inside. We talked about inside the New Mexico Senate earlier. And another is from the outside, because that's the other aspect to this. If you're disillusioned with the legislature, remember, there's a lot of good stuff that's happening on the ground. And I wrote a book in 2016 and 2017 called Another Way Forward, Grassroots Solutions from New Mexico. And that's highlighting so many of the things that are happening in the field of housing, land trusts, the agricultural projects, farm to table projects, health projects that involve community health workers, community paramedicine. These are all things that are happening in our communities that can be scaled up, that can provide solutions to our problems, like the lack of rural healthcare providers, the terrible inequity when it comes to housing. And you can get information on both of those books and even buy them if you want, at my website, which is www.dedefeldman.com/books. And you can go there and check out what they are. And both of them are available through Amazon. And if you have a Kindle and like to read that way, you can buy them through Kindle or at your favorite bookstore like Collected Works or
Oh,
Bookworks.
yeah. That's probably where we'll get it. Thank you so much, Dede. I want to remind our listeners that next week we will have Castil Aguilar and Arte Romero y Carver, two youth advocates and organizers with Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, or Yucca. Okay, thank you all for joining us, and turn on to the, we've still got 4 or 5 more questions to talk about. And so there'll be a lot more on our website later on today. See you next week. Okay, by the miracle of podcast, we're back. And we just talked a little bit about the need for a paid legislature. But one of the things that I've been irked about this session more than in the past is we've got the biggest surplus in the state's history. We've got a lot of clearly COVID exposed all kinds of infrastructure problems, broadband problems, mostly in rural communities, but even downtown Albuquerque. Javier Martinez was conducting a hearing, and he kept cutting out because his broadband was so bad at his home. So, and yet we look at these things. There was a study, you said farm to table. They did this exhaustive study on food systems, and now they're creating a task force to study food systems, but there's no money attached to it. And there's no money in Michael Padilla's broadband thing. And I'm just wondering why the legislature doesn't do something like, okay, we're going to take 3 months to study this, and starting in September, we will start spending $200 million on broadband in rural New Mexico, or implementing some of the strategies from the farm to table study. What's the deal? I mean, it's so conservative, our fiscal policy.
Yes, it's a matter of political will. And usually studies are done to build political will, to give legislators a reason for going forward. But if that political will does not exist, it is, I agree with you, an exercise in frustration. But there's an old joke, when you're a new legislator, you come into the legislature with great ideas. I came in with ideas for public financing of all elected officials, universal health care. And what you emerge with is a small scrap of paper that calls for a study on the transparency of the contributions on the Secretary of State's website. Or a very small item, and it is discouraging. But you need to understand. I think legislators learn the process. They learn when a task force can be effective, and then that information is ready to go when the dam bursts. When the costs of climate change are so extraordinarily bad, and there's a crisis in health care that the legislature must act, then if somebody comes in with an alternative that has been defined in a task force or in a study, it's ready to go. It's on the shelf. So it can be put into action quicker. But it is a very frustrating process. I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Well, I'm also concerned about the inordinate influence of the gas and oil industry and the utility industry in New Mexico policy and politics. It's of course, it's necessary to have stakeholders at the table, but it sometimes seems like gas and oil and P&M and the utilities they're the only ones around the table, and they pretty much get what they want. And any effort to especially regulate gas and oil, or increase their leasing fees or their bonding rates, or their drilling operations, it's like, the sky's going to fall. We're going to move to Texas, and nothing happens. Do you see a path out of this other than waiting for us to have drilled every drop?
Well, this is this is the nut of our problem here in New Mexico. Really, we have we have an economy that is dependent on oil and gas. We have not diversified as we should have in the past. And we have a legislature that is very responsive to that industry that spends, we found in a study that I participated in with New Mexico Ethics Watch, $11.5 million on campaign contributions and expenditures from 2017 to 2020. That's a lot of money. And that's in addition to the 100 or so lobbyists that descend upon the New Mexico legislature every year. And it's really the legislature that they focus on, because they have had better luck. Let me say this, they have had better luck with the legislature than they have with the governor's office, or more recently, the land commissioner. So you will see, I think, the big reforms come when you have the governor or the land commissioner behind it, or the PRC behind it, rather than the legislature itself. I can't tell you how many times the industry came to the legislature to have overturned actions that the PRC took, or actions that one of the executive agencies took. So, so I think that's something you need to think about. Although executives are recipients of oil and gas money too,
Right.
and we should keep our eye on that. But if you look at the legislatures, you will see a bigger proportion of all of their campaign funds coming from that industry than a big gubernatorial campaign.
Right. So this is a departure from the legislature. Retake Our Democracy is moving forward to form a 501c3, Rethink Our Democracy. And its purpose will be to kind of create a think tank and an incubator, and with two main purposes. The first one is just community education on issues when it's not election time or legislative session time, but with the specific idea of trying to bridge the urban-rural divide, and help people understand and connect the dots a little bit, that, you know, we're in this together. And there's a common underlying opposition to social justice and so forth, and it impacts both the rural community and the urban community. And then the other part is to go just a little bit beyond writing and doing some pilot projects that demonstrate the efficacy of some of the principles we've subscribed to at Retake Our Democracy, like cooperatives and worker-owned cooperatives and community land trusts and things like that. I see that in another way forward, Grassroots Solutions might become one of those books that I really need to take a look at, because so far I've been reading mostly Next Systems, Next City, and the Democracy Collaborative, which put out very, very good analysis and models and so forth, but it's not New Mexico homegrown. So can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Sure. Well, I wrote that book largely in 2016 and 2017, just to kind of cheer myself up, because I was feeling like New Mexico was a subject of the brain drain. Young people were leaving the state for jobs, sometimes in the marijuana fields of Colorado, or into the high-tech industry in Texas or Arizona. And we have been, pursuing economic development of a more traditional kind in New
Right.
Mexico, with tax breaks and all kinds of incentives for the big corporations to come and locate here, rather than thinking about what does our traditional economy support, and how could we innovate within that framework. And you're right, it is a rural framework in many ways. So you have to start there. And fortunately, during my time at the legislature, so many advocates and people came forward especially to the Health and Human Services Committee, with great projects that they were doing to recruit healthcare providers to rural areas in the Silver City and in Hidalgo County, or other projects to create affordable housing in gentrifying areas. And usually what happened was they came looking for some help from the legislature. And, the legislature had its own crisis du jour, as I call it. And they were sent away penniless, or sometimes with a tin cup and the right to beg elsewhere. And they did it anyway. And so I figured that we need to look at those projects that are succeeding, and you have a number of them right there in Santa Fe, and see what we can do to highlight them, to learn from them, and to support them when possible. So when you're thinking about creating pilot projects, remember there are a lot of people out there that are already doing this. Right. And many of them are in the food and agriculture business, and they do need help from the government. But so it takes a while, though, for the government to realize that they are worth supporting. But they will. They will. And in the farm to table area, for example, which is the agricultural development here in New Mexico, we have such a water problem, but we have such an opportunity also to lift up our rural economies, and also to address our hunger problem, our chronic disease problem, and feed school children, people that are attending community centers, senior centers. These agricultural products should be used there, should be consumed, rather than importing products from out of state. We could grow a whole agricultural industry by kind of taking in our own laundry, as you see, and that really, and it also has environmental benefits in terms of keeping the valley green. Right. It's a win-win, but we have to look at those agricultural projects that are out there. American Friends Service Committee doing a lot in northern New Mexico, and it could do a lot more to give people in rural New Mexico a job and a future, which I think is lacking for a lot of young people right now, and leading to a whole lot of other problems, as you know.
It's interesting as you were talking about it, because you were making little references to farm to table, things in Santa Fe, that Las Cruces, Silver City project in health. And I'm going like, I've read this. So I think I do have your book.
Maybe you have.
one of the good things I do that annoys the hell out of my wife is I always mark up books and so forth
Oh,
and
me too.
notes in the beginning. And when I was an English teacher, I actually taught students in what I called active reading. It's like you're looking for something when you're reading. And if something puzzles you, there's a reason it's puzzling and you need to think about it. And this was mostly in relation to literature, but it applies to everything. And so, you know, I'm a big marker of books. So now as soon as we get off, I'm going to go hunt down your book and find
Oh,
it.
great. Well, you know, one of the things is about COVID. COVID also has exposed new possibilities, as well as exposed tremendous health inequities. But in order to solve those, one of the groups that I wrote about were community health workers. Community health workers and community health representatives out on the reservations. They have been really meeting people's health needs where they are at for decades without support. We finally got them certified in the legislature, but then the state government somehow dropped the ball, and they were not certified so that they under Medicaid, so that they could get the federal support through Medicaid. So we need to, you know, complete the loop there. And then I think some of these projects could have an even bigger impact.
Well, I'm a big fan of community health workers and promotores. That's a big part of work in the Bay Area, where I'm from, and our consulting firm did a lot of research on promotores, and got funding for, because we also worked in the Central Valley and Modesto and Fresno, and they really deployed these in schools. They would be deployed at schools and meet the family when they come to pick up their kids and things like that. It's a great program.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. I mean, it's culturally relevant.
Right.
It's culturally relevant. And that's the kind of development that we need in New Mexico. Not some transplant thing, but something that is rooted here in our own soil and culture.
Well, and the thing you were talking about food and other small business, you know, there's a multiplier effect when you wind up with a small business that's locally owned and so forth, as opposed to dropping in a Walmart, where all the profit is extracted and goes elsewhere. And I was reading an interesting article the other day about how the governors, the tribal governors, were all excited because they were getting a Walmart in the middle of one of their communities. And I stopped and I said, well, if you have to drive an hour to get food, having a Walmart 5 minutes away is kind of a good thing. But isn't there a different way to do this so that because they also pay terrible wages, and then, you know, don't pay benefits, and then the profit goes elsewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult, and it takes a lot of time, but it can be done, I think.
Well, and I'm grateful for this conversation and for the service you've given to the state of New Mexico. And so thank you for being with us today, Dede. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon, maybe after the legislative session. We'll see how redistricting and health security and early childhood funding and all these things go. You know, we've been very active in the election processes and the primaries over the last 4 years. And we thought we had the legislature primed to go this year. And some things are sailing and look like they're going to get through, but some are coming up against the same kind of roadblocks from the past. So fingers crossed, fingers crossed.
Right, fingers crossed. And remember what that great philosopher Sam Cooke had to say: change is going to come.
Okay.
Change is going to come.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dede. And I wish you well, and we'll definitely talk soon.
Thank you, Paul, for all your work too.
Bye-bye.